welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Glavesky, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I'll be speaking with Chris Kutarna, who is a two-time Governor-General's Medalist, a Sauvé Fellow and Commonwealth Scholar, and a Fellow of the Oxford Martin School with a doctorate in politics from the University of Oxford. A former consultant with Boston Consulting Group, Chris lived in China for several years, speaks Mandarin, and remains a regular op-ed contributor to one of China's top-ranked news magazines. He co-authored The Age of Discovery, Navigating the Risks and Rewards of Our Renaissance, which shows how we can draw courage and wisdom from the last Renaissance in order to fashion our own golden age out of this new Renaissance we find ourselves in. Whether we're seized by Gutenberg or Zuckerberg, the discovery of the Americas or the rise of China, copperplate or silicon etching, a Renaissance moment, we're told, then and now forces humanity to give its best just when the stakes are highest. Age of Discovery navigates the crises of our time and helps us all define a legacy that the world will still celebrate half a millennium from now. We consider a number of questions in this interview, particularly, will AI liberate us or destroy us? What is the role of government in a rapidly changing technological and economic landscape? What happens when the world's concentration of wealth becomes centralized in one place, such as Silicon Valley? What the implications of an increasingly connected world are? What Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump really means? What we as a people need to do to ensure our longevity as a species? Does policy need to be rewritten to adapt to these changing times? Are we facing a productivity paradox whereby the next generation will need to suffer and adjust to changes in order for subsequent generations to reap the rewards? I mean, these are just the tip of the iceberg. We touch on so many topics in this particular interview, so I'm excited to bring you this. So without further ado, you've heard enough from me. I bring you the one and only Chris Kutarna. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Steve, thanks so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and you're joining us all the way from Oxford in the UK.
I am in Oxford, and as per usual, it's cloudy.
It's cloudy. Well, look, we're on the other side of the world, and it's cloudy here too. So yeah,
I was going to ask you to share some of your sun with me, but
yeah. Well, you spent about 6 months living in Melbourne while you were with Boston Consulting Group, so you should know the weather in Melbourne quite well.
Pretty variable, isn't it?
It's very variable. You could have 4 seasons in one day, as they like to say down here. But won't spend too much time talking about the weather. But congrats are in order. I see you recently got your doctorate from Oxford University.
Yeah, actually, my parents just flew in for the graduation ceremony. It was a great day. It's the end of a long journey, let me tell you. So it's nice to cap it off.
Yeah, and what was your major in? What did you what was your PhD all about?
I do politics, and I was looking at contemporary China, understanding political value diversity in China's emerging middle class. Mm-hmm. So apparently, now that I have my doctorate, I can say something knowledgeable about that.
And on China, I mean, you spent quite a bit of your time living there as well.
I was there for about 3 years, working with the Boston Consulting Group, starting and sold my own business before I basically, I guess, decided that I needed to step away and make sense of all my experiences, and that's what led me to Oxford.
Fantastic. Look, I'm really excited to talk to you today, Chris. As I mentioned, prior to hitting the record button, artificial intelligence, the massive upheaval of various industries over the next 10 years is a topic that often comes up on this show. And the question often is, well, what does that mean for for us as a species, and what are the implications for the working class, the affluent, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess that's something that's usually where we leave the conversation. So I'm excited to actually talk to you about that, because you did co-write The Age of Discovery with Ian Golden, and it's all about navigating the risks and rewards of our Renaissance. Can you tell us a little bit about how the collaboration with Ian came to be?
So Ian is the director of a pretty fabulous group here at Oxford called the Oxford Martin School. It's essentially about 300 researchers from across the university, and their mandate is to better understand and find solutions to sort of the big global challenges that humanity faces in the 21st century. So, I mean, typical Oxford modesty.
Yeah.
But it was founded with the largest single gift that Oxford University ever received, a man named James Martin, who was a futurist and whose big belief was that in the 21st century we face extraordinary challenges. And if we're going to meet them, those solutions are going to come at the intersection of different domains of expertise. So the Martin School is explicitly multidisciplinary.
Yeah.
We look at an issue like AI, for example, not just from the perspective of how computer scientists are looking at it, but also philosophers, ethicists, policymakers, and try to look at a big emerging challenge and see it, sort of hold it up in the center and see it from many perspectives. So, I mean, when I arrived at Oxford for my doctorate, I guess kind of like a moth to the flame. I was just so intrigued by this group. Worked my Canadian magic, made friends with Ian, and we just got talking together about the time we live in, about the challenges we face. And out of that conversation, really decided that what we wanted to do was write a book together, which ended up being Age of Discovery. And our basic motivation for writing the book was this sense that, there's a lot of data out there, a lot of facts and analysis to try to see where we are going. But if you look at the history of trying to predict the future and even make sense of the present, we've had a lot of big failures in the last few years. I mean, things like the financial crisis that no one saw them coming, even though the global finance industry is probably the best resourced institution of global governance in the world. I mean, people who should have seen this coming simply didn't. And what our analysis of that is that you can have all the facts and analysis in the world, but if you don't have imagination, then we're going to miss out on sort of what people do in the midst of these circumstances that the facts and the analysis describe. And we living in the present, people are the force of originality and creativity and just unruliness. That means that the line between the yesterday and tomorrow is never going to be straight with us standing here in the present. And so Age of Discovery says, well, let's stretch our imagination about what might happen in the circumstances we live in today by looking to the past and what we've done in similar circumstances. So we really believe that the present is a second Renaissance, that's a great lens to stretch our imagination about the challenges we face and where we're going. And I guess we just felt it so powerfully that, we formed this great partnership together, spent 5 years researching and writing this book, and now it's just wonderful to be at the point to share it.
Yeah, fantastic. You've left me with a few touch points there. I guess I might touch on, the times that we do live in today. And your book reminds us that, we live in pretty amazing times. Life expectancy has risen more in the past 50 years than in the previous 1,000. Global poverty is declining amid population growth, dropping from 40% at the start of the 90s to little more than 12% today. Moreover, anybody with an internet connection today, which is quickly becoming ubiquitous the world over, can get educated for free online. We're generally wealthier, smarter than ever before, and add to that the fact that genomics has the promise of giving us abundant health as well. We're living in pretty amazing times. So why are we so anxious?
I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? So you're absolutely right that, by the macro statistics of health, wealth, education, now is the best time to be alive. And that's pretty much true globally, worldwide. Pick any country, born today, you've got the best chances of any child in your country's history. So that is true. I guess the two big caveats to that are one, distribution, which so the distribution of these gains and the losses, which I think just in the past couple of months, publics broadly around the world, and especially the developed world, are really starting to tune into this issue. In the United States, everyone is riveted by the U.S. presidential election cycle, and so much of what is driving that political question is just the recognition of division and how unequal the distributions of gains and losses through the past 25 years of globalization have been, and people recognizing that, we were naive to think that, when we all connect and open up more to one another, that the benefits are going to spread automatically to everyone, sort of just trickle down. And what we're now recognizing is that when we eliminate barriers and goods and capital and people can flow more and more freely, the benefits pool into those places and into those hands that remain advantaged on whatever dimensions of difference remain.
Right.
And if we want to distribute those gains differently, then we actually have work to do, political work, to change public policies, to change welfare systems, all of that. So that's one big caveat, is these distribution questions, which we're just beginning to come to terms with. The other big caveat, and I think we're not talking enough about this yet, is, so yes, health, wealth, education at an aggregate level have inflated. But before we sort of bank those gains, just like any good business plan, we need to discount them by the new risks, by the heightened risks that we are now exposed to because we are more connected, because we're more knotted together, because we're more vulnerable to one another. The fact that the financial crisis could have an impact globally on the economy, or that something like Zika virus might be a global health threat. And these dangers can move faster and farther than they ever could before. And we can't in one breath count all of our global gains, but in the second breath completely ignore the fact that they come at a cost of heightened risk and heightened vulnerability to one another. And that's a whole other issue that I think we need to come to terms with. And when we start, if we take those two things, the heightened risk and the unequal distribution, then I think we can start to understand very easily how, even though it's the best time to be alive, we are also deeply conflicted and dividing.
Yeah. And I guess on that inequitable distribution, Alec Ross in Industries of the Future depicts that today Silicon Valley is kind of like the Roman Empire, charging all of its provinces taxes. For example,
what a brilliant metaphor.
Yeah, and for example, we've got the likes of Uber. So rather than a local taxi company making money, that money's distributed back to Silicon Valley to Uber. Instead of the local advertising agency or classifieds or newspaper making money, that money, say, goes to Google, and so on, which essentially centralizes a lot of this wealth in Northern California. So, are we headed for mass inequality? What are your thoughts on this?
Brilliant question. Here's another very interesting statistic. Silicon Valley, if you look at the big platform companies like Facebook and Amazon and such, they have about the same market capitalization together as a share of global markets as the auto industry did, the U.S. auto industry, back in the 70s and the 80s.
Wow.
But they employ 1/10 as many people. And that's just the nature of the technology. And, the big challenge that we face on these kind of issues is that technology and business is changing at revolutionary speed. But our public institutions, labor markets, laws, evolve much more slowly. And so there's this growing gap between the outcomes that are being created in the market and by businesses and the social consequences, like the inequality you described. And so, I mean, the reality, and maybe this isn't sexy and cool, but we've got to get a bit policy wonkish about this stuff and recognize that, actually that's what government is for. That's the role of government, is to, collectively decide how do we want to tweak market outcomes so that they reflect certain values that we collectively as a society think are important. Right? So you talk about the gig economy. Are we going to reform our, social safety nets, like employment insurance and child benefits and all those things, to recognize, non-traditional forms of labor contract? Because they're not going to catch up by themselves, so we have to actively do that. Are we going to reform tax laws so that it's harder for a large company to evade taxes or avoid taxes simply by incorporating in Ireland, and keeping those profits overseas in a favorable tax jurisdiction? As you say, there are all sorts of costs that new business models like Uber impose upon local social safety nets. And how do local governments, where does the tax revenue come from to supply services to these people to maintain the roads?
Well, that's exactly right.
If all of the income generated from all these taxi trips is being held offshore somewhere else.
Yeah.
So these are difficult policy questions. It's a great time. I think the 21st century is a great time to get re-interested, to re-engage in our political process, because so many of these questions, there's no easy answer. There's a tough slog of, all of us voting for the parties that we think have the right answers.
Yeah, and you touched on a great point there around the social safety net. I mean, traditionally that's been the domain of employers, but as the gig economy grows and the likes of Uber and Airbnb, I mean, that's not their domain. They essentially employ people as contractors and therefore don't have to worry about dental care and health care and all the rest of it, and that suddenly then becomes the domain of government. And like you said, where does that tax revenue come from? Do you tax people more? Obviously that's something that people aren't all that hospitable towards. It just poses so many questions. And yeah.
No, and that is just a small example.
Yeah.
Of a crisis, a governance crisis that is ubiquitous right now, because we're so tangled together. Relationships between cause and effect, between where sort of costs are incurred and where the revenues to cover them are recognized, are so complex now that they just break down. Yeah. And it is so difficult. Basic questions like who is accountable? Who is responsible? What is fair? These are the fundamental questions upon which, societies are held together. And they're so difficult to answer right now because of the tangled nature of our economic systems, our business models, and that government just can't keep up with us. It's a totally ubiquitous issue. It's a real challenge. It's a hard time to govern well. Yeah,
and you touched on the GFC a few times, and essentially that was one area where government either lacked the pace or the ability to keep up. We look at the financial system, and while collectively the market capitalization is absolutely massive, at the same time you're talking about legacy infrastructure and layers and thousands upon thousands of systems worldwide that not even Lehman Brothers could understand how heavily leveraged they were. And that's one of the, I suppose, challenges there. But on policy adaptation, in New York State, some of the money transmission laws date back to the 19th century when money was transmitted by horse and buggy. And today, obviously, we're dealing with zeros and ones. And a few years from now, who knows, we may have money flying all over the place via the blockchain. So what are your thoughts on, policy adaptation? It seems like we're trying to put a square peg into a round hole oftentimes when trying to look at today's technologies and business models through, say, an early 20th century or even, in some cases, a 19th century lens.
Well, so on that question, I would say here is the silver lining in shock events like Brexit. So it's happened, about a month ago here in the UK, was a major surprise to a lot of people. Actually, my co-author and I, we publicly predicted it in the weeks leading up to it. We said, if you're seeing the world through the lens that we look at it as a second Renaissance, this should be our default expectation. But, that aside for a moment, the silver lining is that before an event like Brexit, if you look through the capitals of Europe, there just wasn't much will or urgency to fix the real tough governance problems that Europe was just structurally beset with. Then this giant crisis happens, and come sort of the following week, across the capitals of Europe, there was fresh will. There was fresh energy. There was fresh belief that even long-standing established rules and orders could be radically reshaped, because the British public had just shown them that was possible with Europe. And 500 years ago, Martin Luther showed Europe that when he broke the Catholic Church in half in an event called the Protestant Reformation. And I think, Bernie Sanders, even Donald Trump, over the past couple of months have helped the U.S. public to recognize that there may be money in politics and there may be all sorts of inertia in our political system. But wow, if you bring together a significant share of the population around a sense of discontent with the way the system is set up now, there is a force for change there. So, I agree that institutions evolve very slowly, but I think in your question, there's a sort of an assumption that sort of the status quo benefits from a lot of inertia. And I think that the right way to think about the time we live in now is that there is so much fundamental change underway that really everything is already in motion. The inertia is broken. The status quo isn't going to remain status quo unless those who want to renew it, actively do so. And those who want to change it, now is the best time to try, because I think there is a real will to reshape fundamentally the way the world is organized right now.
Yeah. And I think, you hit the nail on the head there with Brexit, where we essentially saw people who, I suppose, don't live in this progressive libertarian bubble of ours, I suppose, who pushed back. And this was the result of them feeling like their voice wasn't echoed by their parliamentarians, by the EU. There was this concept of inclusive globalization, which is definitely not accounting for people who don't live in London, people on the fringes. And, what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years is increased automation of jobs, resulting in more people being left without a job. And, traditionally we've looked at people from, working class backgrounds on the assembly line, in service jobs. And those are the types of jobs which are, more and more prone to automation, to artificial intelligence taking over. Anything that can be codified can be automated. So what does that mean for the divide between the skilled, let's just say the tertiary educated, and the not tertiary educated, the white collar and the blue collar, and so on?
What is so interesting about the history of technological change is, a lot of us, we've grown up, and, for us, the history of the 20th century is maybe, the one we understand best. And the 20th century really taught us to believe or to expect that technology is going to solve all of our problems. Going all the way back to Thomas Edison, who was the American who he industrialized the process of invention and became so successful at it that we've just learned to expect every year technology is going to deliver us, faster, better, more responsive, cheaper, against whatever barriers reality throws up to us. So that we've now got this expectation that, technology is going to solve all of our problems. You see it on present discourse on climate change, for example. And the truth is that's not how technology works at all. Yeah. Technology never solves our problems. It just replaces existing problems with new ones. Is a much better way to think about it. And I think, AI and robotics and automation is the site of technological transformation that's really going to teach the 21st century that truth all over again. There is tremendous potential for robotics and AI to gift humanity with abundant labor and abundant cognitive resources, and that sounds wonderful. The challenge is, to whom are the benefits going to flow? Right? Is it going to flow to the people who own the robots? What about the people whose jobs are destroyed, or frame it in a happier way, who are liberated by the robots from the toil of manual labor in the service industry? I mean, is that how we're going to think about it, or are we going to have chronic unemployment?
Yeah.
So this is going to be. We've done research here at the Martin School, looking to 2050, and our prediction is that 47% of all U.S. jobs today are at high risk of automation by 2050. And as you said, we were discussing this earlier, right now most people work in the service industry. That's sort of the last refuge once the robots take over, the sort of agricultural sector and the mining sector and the manufacturing sector. We all move into services. What happens when we no longer need me to write articles for the newspaper or to do routine clerical work at the law firm, or to work the checkout, or to drive the truck? Where do we go from there? And are we going to create whole new industries and new jobs to employ half of the U.S. workforce? Actually, so far in the first 10 years or so of the 21st century, that hasn't proven the case. New technology has destroyed more jobs than it has created.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And, a lot of people, and myself included, sometimes like to point to the fact that, hey, with every evolution or with every onset of disruptive innovation, more jobs are created. But that's not always the case. I mean, traditionally, if you look at agriculture at the start of the 20th century, about 80% of Americans were farmers. Now that number is 2%. Obviously, they've moved on to other things, but that's not always the case. And I remember reading a report recently which saw that the top 10 or so occupations in the United States are prone to being automated in some way, shape, or form, and that includes things like many banking professions, financial audit, financial reporting, a lot of the accounting professions, and many legal professions, including the paralegal research-based work. I saw a fantastic video recently about horses and equating them to human beings in some way. When the automobile came along, when the automobile came along, horses perhaps just said to themselves, "Oh, don't worry, we've been through this before. They'll find new jobs for us." But the population of horses actually peaked in something like 1915, and it's been backwards for them ever since, except for horse racing and mounted police and the odd carnival here and there. So their purpose was more or less taken away from them. So on the topic of artificial intelligence either liberating us or destroying us, is it possible that we may get to a point where things like AI, blockchain, distributed autonomous organizations, and so on, create enough wealth for us to, I suppose, precede a new social contract of sorts where we don't have to work as much? Or does the question of distribution then come up again?
I think it's going to be the latter. I mean, we already live in a world where technology has created wealth to the point where we don't have to work as much. But we haven't chosen a distribution whereby, we're distributing all the wealth so that everyone can work a 30-hour work week or a 20-hour work week. Instead what we've decided is full-time work is, 40 to 60 hours, whatever the industry is. And there is either that chunk for you or there's not. Now, the gig economy is what has emerged to fill the gap, right? But certainly people who work in the gig economy don't feel like, at a distribution level, society has decided to top up, the 20 hours that they don't work per week. Yeah. So it's always going to be, this is humanity, right? This is not utopia. It's always going to be about distribution. There are always going to be these political questions. And AI is going to be no different. It's not going to suddenly change human nature. It will just change the site, the particular instance of the debate. And I think, again, if history is any guide, yes, we will destroy a lot of jobs through automation, and we will create a lot of new jobs that right now just don't exist. If Amazon has its way and is delivering everything to us through drones, you can bet that there's going to be a whole industry of people who go out and perform drone repair.
Yeah.
Retrieve the drone that got caught in the tree, or that battery got hit by a wind gust and hit a building, whatever. There's going to be drones littered everywhere. And probably, someone is going to set up a really valuable IT company with an app and a whole workforce like Deliveroo that is going to go find the drones and fix them. And they'll probably be pretty well-paid jobs because you'll need to understand enough about the engineering of those devices to actually make the repair. I think the more realistic fear is, our generation, our kids' generation, is going to live through the transition, right? And what's the lag going to be between, my job being destroyed and the new job emerging? There may very well be a lag. And how much help in my country or my community is society around going to give me to make that adjustment and maybe just survive the loss of employment through to the next generation when society as a whole finally adjusts.
Yeah.
There's always frictions, when big revolution happens. And we suffer those frictions.
You read my mind there, Chris, and I was going to talk about the productivity paradox, whereby any disruptive innovation, generally there's a period of decline for industry and for individuals before bouncing back. So you look at manufacturing, the transition from steam to electricity. It took about 40 years, during which time productivity actually went backwards before bouncing back. And your co-author, Ian Golden, while he spoke at Google Zeitgeist, he basically said the Renaissance in Europe actually sent us backwards for hundreds of years. So, going back to your point about history being an indicator of the future, might it be that we have to go through, as you've just alluded to, that generation of difficulty to get to the next Renaissance? And
I think I agree. And I think we're going through it. If you look at Robert Gordon, who's an economist of growth, he's come out with kind of the longitudinal study that says, basically that the computer has had less impact on productivity and incomes than the flush toilet. And so he's kind of negative on, how quickly we are innovating and how quickly our current technologies raising productivity and hence incomes. I'm much more of an optimist there, and I really think that this is the step backwards while we are adjusting to a radically new normal, but that there's going to be, I think, a long period of growth off the back of computerization and all of the things that come with it, synthetic biology, automation, robotics, really everything driven by computers. Just an interesting point there. We've now lived with computers for kind of at a personal level, 25, 30 years. So the sexiness of these devices it's kind of worn off on us. But from if you step back and look at history, it really is the biggest information revolution in the history of life on Earth. Philosophers of science, we talk about 4 big information revolutions that dramatically increased just the quantity of information available. And information historically is sort of, our most precious resource. The invention of spoken language. In 2003, we traded more unique data on the internet than all words ever spoken in human history in 1 year. And the next two big information revolutions were writing and then printing. And I think it was 2006, 2007 that in a single year we produced more data than the entire history of writing and print. So, as a civilization, we're actually born into this moment of information superabundance. We are awash in data, and we don't know what to do with it, frankly, yet. But we are developing the computers that are going to help us to do that. And if you believe that information is a civilization's most valuable resource, any civilization in history would love to trade places with us just because we're so rich. In that most important resource. So eventually, I just feel, the economists, their statistics are going to reflect the reality of how wealthy in ideas our civilization is, and every year is becoming more so. So there's my fundamental kick for optimism. Okay, a lot of things to be upset about, but
I'll throw another one about optimism in there. Peter Diamandis likes to say that children today have access to more information than the President of the United States had 15 years ago, which is super exciting, because if you've got access to information, the emerging technologies, and people from all over the world, really, with an internet connection to collaborate with, you can create amazing things. But on that, it seems as if many people, while we acknowledge that we are living in these exciting, empowering times, if Brexit tells us anything, if the support for Donald Trump in the United States tells us anything, it shows us that there's a trend towards growing disillusionment with the economic realities of today, growing nationalism. How much of this comes down to the messaging? How much of this comes down to what also Peter Diamandis calls it the Crisis News Network, or CNN, constantly reporting negative news stories, despite the fact that violence is decreasing, access to education is increasing, food is becoming more plentiful, and so on?
I mean, I think that the right way to make sense of, pretty much anything is to look for both sides. So this technology has, as you say, it's been so wonderful, it's so empowering. Here's another statistic for you. In 1990, half of humanity was illiterate. Today, it's down to about 12%, even though we've added 2.5 billion people to the human race in the meantime, which is extraordinary. And part of the reason is that there's so much more incentive to learn to read and write now because of things like computers and the internet. But I think that the right way to live through this time, and this is what the book is about too, is to say that, the present is a contest. And if you see a dramatic positive, look for the negative. We can't be Pollyannic about the time we live in. We have to understand that there is equal opportunity and risk, and which proves the stronger. That's really what's going to determine which way the 21st century goes. That's the role that we all need to play, to try to magnify the positive consequences and mitigate the risks. So I think that, for me, that's the starting point. And so you look at what is happening, in the world today, like the shocking viability of Trump as a candidate, or Brexit, or ISIS. ISIS is the most successful foreign recruiter of fighters since the Spanish Civil War. And how is that possible? In large part thanks to social media. That there is now this new technology that allows you to broadcast your discontent or your ideology, to bind together people who share it, and to amplify your message, make it very powerful, and to distribute an idea like there is something glorious and dignifying about killing yourself if you kill other people along the way. What a horrific idea. But it spreads, and people are seduced by it.
Yeah.
So we live in that reality too. And I think, so my message there is we just need to be, I guess, open-eyed about this truism that there are, sharp opportunities and also risks, and we just need to step in and play our part to try to help things turn out right. Because we can't, as some people want to suggest, we can't sort of put the genie back in the bottle. I don't believe. I mean, I think that's just not in our human DNA to say that, okay, we've become too connected and too vulnerable to one another. We've given ourselves too loud a voice, too much power in these devices that's in our pocket.
Yeah.
Right now, we need to, de-evolve to a simpler level of civilization where, we feel we have a better handle on its costs and complexities. I mean, that's just not our world, right?
Yeah.
And that's just not the human. That's just not. That's not the human spirit.
No.
We need to evolve.
Yeah.
We need to become, and not necessarily more complex, but maybe smarter.
Yeah.
More aware.
Yeah. Or as Peter Thiel likes to say, if everything worth doing has already been done, you may as well become a barista and feign an allergy to achievement. His words, not mine. But you mentioned earlier, Chris, that we're living in an exciting time where we have the opportunity to change the status quo. And, you've just alluded to the fact that we need to drive that change to ensure that it doesn't get out of hand, we don't leave people behind and so on. And, I mean, how important is it that we see, given that government is so slow to respond in the face of rapid advances in technology, that we see more collaboration between enterprise, academia, NGOs, and so on?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I really believe leading companies have to lead.
Yeah.
Right? And, coalitions of the willing, I guess, has a bad connotation now with George W. Bush. But, coalitions of the willing have to get going.
Yeah.
There are a lot of issues that actually you don't need everyone to agree. Mm-hmm. You don't need all the countries of the world. You don't need all the employees to agree that this is, a sacrifice worth making or an urgent issue worth solving. You just got to identify who are the big levers. In climate change, it's really like 4 countries. There's China, there's the US, there's Russia and India. Together, they're, I think, 2/3 of global carbon emissions. So what they decide is what shapes the world. And the financial system was the same thing. And part of the mistake that regulators made, I guess almost 10 years ago, is they tried to keep up with the complexity of financial networks and lost sight of some simple truths, that there were a half dozen, systemically important nodes in that system. It just so happened that, AIG, Lehman Brothers were 2 of them.
Yeah.
But if we just focus on the most important contributors to health or instability and make sure that they're doing the right things, the overall system can survive a lot of errors and blindness, in our limited cognitive capacity. So, there is absolutely, I think, the urgency of so many of the opportunities and risks that we face today means that, multilateral, where everyone is on board, is great. But, coalitions of the willing get together, go first. And you see this at every level. I mean, there are some great municipal initiatives. The C50 is a group of 50 of the largest cities in the world that have sort of had a list of, here's what we as cities are going to do to affect some big global issues that we're all impacted by. And then they run and do it, and they have tremendous global impact. So I completely agree that now is the time to get started, form coalitions of the willing, and let other people join in. Yeah,
and I definitely see that happening amongst private enterprise, startups, SMEs, and whatnot, people who actually want to see that change, actually go out and do it. Go first. Don't wait for government, because oftentimes government will, prepare a study and release a report and commission X and Y and Z, and then nothing really ever eventuates. And I mean, that's not true in all cases, and I'm not one to generalize, but we definitely are entering an age where, given the rapidly lowering barriers to entry, given the access to information, technology, access to people on the other side of the world with a simple Skype call, as is the case right now, private enterprise do have the power, and coalitions of the willing do have the power to drive that change. And I think it's yep.
And fortune favors the bold. I mean, there is this unfortunate human instinct in times of rapid change and upheaval and shock to hesitate, to just put pause to everything, to delay investment, to delay any bets, because we just feel like we don't understand the moment we live in. But 500 years ago, Machiavelli, in a similar time of change, he told the princes of Italy, fortune favors the bold. In a time of rapid upheaval, that's when you have to continue your practice of making bets and taking risks. Because, by the way, all of this change around us is rendering whatever our present habits and choices may be invalid.
Yeah.
So stasis is not an option, because whatever half-life our current setup has is just getting shorter and shorter. Mm-hmm. And it's bold initiative-taking, it's risk-taking that shocks us out of our habits that are rapidly becoming outdated and shocks us into new ones. And so you see this mistake being made over and over every day. I mean, I think that the last stat I saw is, Fortune 500 companies, a big enterprise, is sitting on the largest cash pile in the history of capitalism. Because nobody wants to make the bet and be wrong. But by sitting on that cash, they're actively destroying value for their shareholders, because there are so many small and medium enterprises and startups that are not sitting back, are saying, well, fine, if you are going to be a dinosaur, I will happily be the next species that invades your industry and takes over. And that's the wonderful, I think, opportunity. In a time of rapid change. It really does reward the risk takers. Yeah,
and I was having a conversation with the head of Techstars in London, which is the world's largest startup accelerator, about this very fact, how many of these large companies are, let's say, hesitant to take small bets and experiment. And as a result, you've got these 5-year, 10-year strategic plans, which may have made sense back in the 20th century, but now when things are moving as quickly as they are, it's difficult enough to have a 1 or 2 year strategic plan, let alone one that's 5 or 10 years long. And companies that are succeeding are the ones who are willing to experiment, are willing to take lots of small bets. And when you look at some of the big disruptions, like Airbnb disrupting hotel industry, that disruption came from outside the industry, or Uber disrupting the taxi industry, that disruption also came from outside the industry. But these are organizations who have that culture of experimentation, of failing in order to learn what you don't know, embedded into their DNA.
And I think, that is, I think, the brilliant sort of private sector example of what we're trying to do here in Oxford at the Oxford Martin School, which is to say, the biggest breakthroughs, the disruptive changes, and the ahas are coming at the intersection of different domains of expertise. So when you bring together a deep understanding of the sharing economy and how these apps work with a very traditional industry like hotellery, you suddenly recognize the opportunity. I think that's there's definitely it's at these crossroads. That's the fertile ground right now.
Yeah. Well, as Steve Jobs used to say, you can only connect the dots looking backwards, and I think that's just pretty much hitting the nail on the head. Bringing together diverse experiences, diverse people, skill sets, and so on will generate better solutions than people from one industry or from one domain area of expertise working in isolation. So thank you so much, Chris, for your time. But we're down to the lightning round. So this is a bit
Okay.
Yeah, this is a bit of fun that I like to have with all of my guests. It's 3 questions. So just say the first thing that comes to mind. The first question is, if you could work for any company at any stage of the company life cycle, who would it be and why?
Oh boy, probably Intel at its origins.
Yeah.
And why? Because I'm plagiarizing Steve Jobs too. But computer is the bicycle for the brain.
Yeah.
And the bicycle is Steve Jobs saying, the bicycle is what makes humans more efficient as a transport than any other species. Without the bicycle, we're way down the list. With the bicycle, we're number 1. And the computer is the same for our cognitive capacity. Wow. Yeah. Intel really has probably done more, I think, to shape the 21st century than any company, just that technology. I would have loved them at the beginning of that.
Great answer. Question number 2, Chris, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Oh, I would probably ask, it would be Nelson Mandela. And I would probably ask him, where does your faith in humanity come from? Because I think it takes real faith to believe that the kind of approach that he took, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sharing power with the very people who had put him in prison for 20 years. I mean, we need that kind of faith in one another right now. And where he found that, I'd like to try to find it again. Yeah,
definitely. And finally, Chris, I ask all my guests how they stay on top of their games. I mean, you've just released a new book, you've just received your doctorate, and you're an accomplished rower and rowing coach. So do you have any rituals or routines to help you stay on top of your game?
Ask my girlfriend for advice before I make any major decision. She can play. Life partner. Need to have the right life partner.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Love it. So where can people go to find out a little bit more about yourself, Chris, and pick up a copy of the book?
You can go to my website, Kutarna, KUTARNA.net, and that's a link to everything. The book itself is on Amazon sites worldwide and in most major bookstores.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, Chris. You've been an awesome guest, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day in cloudy England.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a real pleasure to come on your show and to speak to your listeners.
Well, that's it for my chat with Chris Kutarna. We'll make sure to include all of the resources and links in the show notes for you lucky listeners. As always, a quick update on the happenings around the Traps at Collective Campus. We are, of course, hosting Ash Moria later this month on August the 31st. If you'd like to pick up a ticket to partake in our very first Future Squared Live, you can do so at collectivecamp.us/events. We have just announced that we'll be running 14-hour startup, 2-day intensive where you get to take an idea through to business model, through to prototype, through to testing in just 2 days. So you can find out a little bit more about that at collectivecamp.us/classes. And that is really just the tip of the iceberg. We've got a ton of classes, workshops, courses on emerging skill sets and technologies taking place at Collective Campus. Over the next few months, you can find out a bit more about that at our website. We've got online resources, blogs, videos, webinars, infographics, all that good stuff. So just check out our website to find out a little bit more about all the happenings, all the going-ons, and all of the resources that you can get access to today. If you're liking what we're putting down, if you're picking up what we're putting down rather, I'd love it if you take just a minute of your time to like us, subscribe, and or share this podcast with your friends. You can do so via iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. Until next time, Future Squared out.